A royal mistress could disappear from history in less than a year, even after standing beside the most powerful man in the kingdom. At the Tudor court, admiration was bright but dangerously brief, and a woman's place could change before she even realized it had begun to fade. Behind the velvet gowns, whispered letters, and candle-lit halls lived a quieter truth about how royal favor slowly turned into silence. Tonight, we step beyond the glittering palace to follow the forgotten life that began after the attention ended. So, before you feel comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel, only if your heart truly wants to. If you do like it, leave a little comment letting me know what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights. Adjust the pillow to fit your head. Maybe turn on a fan to create a relaxing atmosphere. And let's begin this journey together tonight. If a traveller had quietly observed the inner life of the Tudor court, they might have noticed that power there rarely rested on written rules. It moved through glances, conversations, and the shifting attention of powerful men. Favour was not something recorded in documents or protected by law. It existed only as long as the man who granted it wished it to exist. For women who became royal mistresses, this fragile system shaped every hour of their lives. At first, the attention of a powerful figure could feel like the opening of an entirely new world. A woman who once lived in relative obscurity might suddenly find herself invited into rooms lined with tapestries and lit by rows of candles. Servants, who had never noticed her before, now stepped aside with careful respect. Courtiers lowered their voices when she entered, not out of fear, but out of curiosity. Attention itself was a kind of currency. In the Tudor court, proximity to a king or nobleman carried enormous influence. A single smile from a powerful man could elevate a woman's status overnight. Her family might gain invitations to court. Her name might appear in conversations among nobles who previously ignored it. Even the smallest sign of favour could ripple outward through the social world surrounding the palace. Yet this new status carried a quiet instability. Unlike marriage, which was protected by the authority of the church and reinforced by legal tradition, the position of a mistress had no official foundation. There were no charters confirming her role, no letters patent guaranteeing her protection. Nothing that could secure her place once attention began to drift elsewhere. Her position existed entirely within the will of one man. This meant that every gesture of affection contained an unspoken condition. The gifts, the invitations, the attention in crowded halls all depended on continued interest. If that interest faded, the entire structure supporting her life could collapse with surprising speed. In the grand halls of Tudor palaces, such uncertainty was not considered unusual. The court itself operated through a system of shifting alliances and personal loyalties. Power circulated through relationships rather than institutions. The favour granted today might belong to someone else tomorrow. Everyone within that environment understood this reality. Servants observed it in silence as they carried trays of wine through banquet rooms. Noble women recognized it in the careful politeness exchanged across dining tables. Even musicians playing during feasts sensed how attention drifted from one favored face to another. A royal mistress lived directly inside this fragile atmosphere. Her chambers might be decorated with embroidered curtains and polished furniture. Yet the comfort they offered was temporary. Those rooms were not truly hers. They belonged to the palace, and the palace belonged to the crown. What was granted could just as easily be reassigned. The same uncertainty surrounded the gifts she received. Jewelry sparkled under candlelight. Velvet gowns rustled softly across marble floors. Small estates or allowances might be promised as gestures of generosity. Yet even these rewards often depended on the continued goodwill of the man who offered them. Without written agreements or legal recognition, generosity remained a personal choice rather than a permanent guarantee. Because of this, every royal mistress learned to watch the court carefully. She listened to the tone of conversations in corridors. She noticed which courtiers greeted her warmly and which avoided her eyes. She measured small changes in the behavior of servants and attendants. These subtle details revealed more than any official announcement could. In a society governed by ceremony and hierarchy, change rarely arrived through open declarations. Instead, it appeared gradually through altered patterns of behavior. Invitations became less frequent. Conversations shortened. Faces that once showed admiration began to display polite indifference. To those outside the palace walls, the life of a royal mistress might have appeared luxurious and secure. Stories circulated about lavish gifts, secret meetings, and the intoxicating glamour of court life. Yet those who lived within that world understood how fragile such privilege could be. Favor was powerful, but it was never stable. A king might grow bored. A nobleman might become cautious. A new face might capture attention. None of these shifts required explanation. In the quiet language of the court, they simply happened. For the woman, at the center of that attention, this reality produced a strange mixture of excitement and unease. She could experience admiration and influence beyond what most women of her time ever imagined. At the same time, she knew that none of it rested on firm ground. Her future depended on something far less predictable than law or tradition. It depended on affection, and affection, in the Tudor court, was often the most unstable force of all. Courtiers understood this truth instinctively. They watched carefully, waiting to see whose presence beside the king might grow brighter and whose might begin to fade. Reputation at court could rise and fall without warning, and the entire palace adjusted itself to these subtle shifts. In such an environment, survival required patience, awareness, and restraint. Speaking too boldly could create enemies. Demanding security could provoke resentment. A mistress had to navigate the court like someone walking across thin ice, aware that every step carried risk. This was the hidden reality behind the glittering image of Tudor romance. Beneath the velvet gowns and candlelit banquets existed a social structure built entirely on personal favor. It produced moments of dazzling privilege, but it also ensured that every position remained temporary. What appeared stable from a distance was, in truth, constantly moving. And within that movement, every woman who rose through royal affection quietly understood the same unspoken rule. She could be replaced. Royal favor could raise a woman to the center of Tudor power, yet it offered no promise that the position would endure. For a time, she might walk through the palace surrounded by admiration and luxury, believing that the attention around her meant security. But inside those same halls, another stage of court life was already unfolding, one where favor reached its brightest moment before beginning to fade. The height of royal favor in the Tudor court often arrived quietly, yet once it appeared, it changed everything surrounding a woman's life. What had once been distant suddenly became familiar. Corridors that previously felt intimidating now opened before her with a strange sense of belonging. Her presence began to settle close to the center of power. In the great halls of the palace, proximity meant more than comfort. It meant influence. Seating arrangements at banquets, positions during ceremonies, and the direction of a king's gaze all carried meaning. When a woman stood near the king or shared private conversations with him, the entire court noticed. No announcement was required. Courtiers simply observed. Servants learned to recognize the new order of importance. They stepped aside more quickly when she passed. Doors opened without hesitation. Even the smallest request was carried through the palace with surprising efficiency. The change was visible not only in behavior, but in the objects that surrounded her. Rich clothing arrived first. Velvet gowns in deep colors were delivered by royal tailors. Sleeves embroidered with gold thread brushed softly against polished wood furniture. Pearls rested against the pale linen of a chemise, catching the warm reflections of candlelight. Each garment spoke quietly of generosity. Such clothing did more than decorate the body. In the Tudor world, it communicated status. A woman wearing costly fabric signaled that someone powerful stood behind her. The court read these signs instantly. Every jewel, every ribbon, every carefully sewn detail suggested that royal attention had settled upon her. Gifts followed the clothing. Jewelry boxes appeared with little explanation. Rings set with gemstones changed hands during private meetings. Sometimes small estates or allowances were granted, providing income that would have seemed unimaginable earlier in her life. These rewards created a visible transformation. Rooms inside the palace were assigned for her comfort. Fires burned steadily in the hearth during cold evenings. Servants arranged meals, prepared baths, and ensured that daily inconveniences quietly disappeared before they could irritate. To outsiders, such a life might have appeared almost unreal. Stories travelled beyond palace walls about women who lived surrounded by luxury because of royal affection. In towns and villages, people imagined a world filled with endless banquets, music, and shining jewels. Yet, inside the palace, admiration carried another dimension. At Onshan, wherever the favoured woman moved, conversation seemed to drift toward her presence. Courtiers lowered their voices when she passed. Not out of hostility, but curiosity, they studied her gestures, her clothing, even the expressions she exchanged with the king. Her name began to circulate through whispers. Sometimes it appeared during quiet conversations between noblewomen. Sometimes it travelled through the palace kitchens, carried by servants who had witnessed a glance or overheard a fragment of conversation. The court possessed a remarkable ability to transform observation into rumour. Each whisper added to the sense that this woman had become part of the palace's living story. Her presence was discussed, interpreted, and quietly analysed by those who wished to understand how power was moving. For the mistress herself, this attention could feel intoxicating. She might walk through long galleries decorated with portraits of kings and queens, aware that she now belonged to the same world of influence. Conversations with courtiers became easier. Invitations arrived more frequently. Her daily life began to revolve around the rhythms of royal activity. Yet even at this bright moment, the structure supporting her life remained fragile. None of the wealth surrounding her belonged fully to her name. The chambers, the servants, the jewellery, and even the attention itself depended on one simple condition: continued affection. The Tudor court rarely forgot this truth. Behind the admiration and the luxuries, everyone understood that favour could move. A king's attention might linger for months or years, but it could also drift without warning. The same palace that celebrated a woman's rise had witnessed many such rises before, and it had witnessed many quiet disappearances as well. For now, however, the favoured woman stood at the centre of court life. Music echoed through the halls. Candles flickered across polished floors, and her name continued to travel through the palace in low voices filled with curiosity. The moment was bright, perhaps brighter than she herself realized. At the height of royal favour, a woman could stand astonishingly close to the centre of Tudor power, surrounded by gifts, comfort, and attention. Her name moved through the palace in whispers that carried admiration, curiosity, and quiet calculation. Yet, within those same whispers, the court was already preparing itself for the moment when admiration might begin to change. The first signs of fading favour rarely arrived with noise. In the Tudor court, change often appeared quietly, hidden inside ordinary routines that once seemed comforting and familiar. At first, nothing dramatic occurred. The palace still echoed with music during evening feasts. Courtiers continued their polite conversations beneath painted ceilings. Servants carried wine through long halls, as they had done every night before. To anyone observing from a distance, the life of the favoured woman appeared unchanged. Yet small details began to shift. One of the earliest changes appeared in the rhythm of private summons. In the past, messages from the king's attendants arrived regularly, sometimes late in the evening. sometimes during the quiet hours of the afternoon. These invitations carried a particular tone of urgency. Servants moved quickly to deliver them, and the palace seemed to understand that the king's attention had turned toward her once again. Gradually, those summons became less frequent. An evening passed without a message. Then another day followed in silence. Soon, an entire week might go by without the familiar knock at her chamber door. Each absence seemed easy to explain. The king was busy with matters of state. A council meeting lasted longer than expected. A hunting expedition required early travel at dawn. None of these explanations sounded unreasonable, but together they formed a pattern. The woman who once stood close to the center of royal attention began to feel the distance growing between herself and the man whose affection had once shaped her life. At the same time, another presence often began to appear within the palace. A younger woman arrived at court. She might be introduced as the daughter of a noble family, newly returned from the countryside. Sometimes she came as part of a household serving the queen or another high-ranking lady. Her arrival rarely seemed significant at first. The Tudor court welcomed new faces constantly, yet certain details attracted attention. Courtiers noticed how frequently the king's gaze rested upon her. Servants observed the length of their conversations. Noblewomen measured the subtle shifts in seating arrangements during feasts. No announcement was made. Yet the palace began to sense that the balance of attention was slowly moving. For the woman who had once enjoyed that attention, the change could feel strangely unsettling. Nothing had been said directly. No accusation had been spoken. The king himself might continue to greet her with the same familiar courtesy. But the atmosphere surrounding those interactions had altered. Where warmth had once existed, there was now restraint. During public ceremonies, the king's glance passed over her more quickly than before. Conversations that once lingered comfortably now ended after only a few polite exchanges. Even gestures that seemed friendly carried a new formality. The court understood such signals instantly. In Tudor society, power often communicated itself through behavior rather than words. The direction of a glance, the tone of a greeting, or the position assigned during a banquet could reveal more than any public declaration. Servants, who moved quietly through every corner of the palace, often sensed these changes first. They noticed hesitation in instructions that had once been delivered confidently. Gifts that once arrived without delay began to appear less often. Courtiers followed close behind. They watched the favored woman carefully, measuring her position through small rituals of politeness. Some continued to greet her warmly, hoping that favor might yet return. Others shifted their attention toward the younger woman, whose presence had begun to attract quiet admiration. In this environment, uncertainty could last for weeks. The woman who sensed the change might still receive occasional invitations. She might still attend banquets and celebrations where laughter echoed through the hall. Yet beneath that familiar surface, the structure of her life had begun to weaken. Hope lingered. Perhaps the king's interest had only been distracted for a short time. Perhaps the younger woman would fade from attention as quickly as she had appeared. In a court where affection often moved unpredictably, such possibilities seemed believable. But the palace itself rarely forgot how these stories usually ended. Favor did not vanish suddenly. It drifted, like candlelight slowly dimming in a long corridor. Admiration lost its brightness little by little until the change could no longer be denied. The woman who once stood at the center of royal attention now felt the court shifting around her. Familiar voices sounded more distant. Conversations seemed to pass her by. And somewhere within the palace, the quiet excitement surrounding a new favorite continued to grow. The fading of royal favor rarely began with confrontation, but with small silences and subtle changes in behavior. A woman who once received constant attention could find herself waiting through evenings that had once belonged to her, somewhere within the palace walls. Another story was quietly beginning to unfold, one that would soon make those silences impossible to ignore. Silence in the Tudor court rarely arrived suddenly. It appeared slowly, almost politely, settling into the spaces where attention had once been constant. At first, the absence felt small. The favoured woman might wake in her chamber, expecting the familiar rhythm of palace life to continue as it always had. Servants would open the shutters to let pale morning light fall across the tapestries. Footsteps would echo faintly through the corridor, somewhere beyond the walls. Cooks prepared the first meal of the day. Yet one familiar detail had disappeared: the private letters. During the height of royal affection, messages from the king or his attendants often arrived without warning. Sometimes they were short notes, written quickly, inviting her to join him in a quiet chamber or to walk through the gardens before evening ceremonies began. At other times, they carried small tokens, folded carefully within the paper. These letters held a particular excitement. They arrived suddenly. They carried intimacy. They suggested that somewhere within the palace, the king was thinking of her alone. When the silence began, those letters simply stopped appearing. At first, the absence seemed temporary. A busy schedule could explain the delay. Affairs of state, diplomatic meetings, or hunting expeditions often occupied the king's time. Waiting felt reasonable. Days passed. Then more days. The familiar knock at the door never came. Servants who once carried sealed notes through the corridor now passed by without stopping. The small moments of anticipation that had once shaped her afternoons quietly vanished from daily life. Another change followed close behind. The gifts stopped arriving. Royal affection in the Tudor court often expressed itself through objects. Jewellery appeared in velvet-lined boxes. New gowns were delivered by palace tailors. Rare fabrics, perfumes, or small pieces of land sometimes accompanied these gestures of generosity. Each gift had carried a message. It meant attention still existed. It meant admiration remained alive. It meant her presence still mattered. When the silence began, these objects disappeared just as quietly as the letters. Weeks passed without the arrival of a new jewel or a carefully folded piece of silk. Tailors no longer appeared with measurements for another gown. Messengers who once carried small surprises through palace halls now walked past her chamber without pause. None of this was explained. The Tudor court did not rely on announcements when attention changed. Instead, the palace allowed absence itself to communicate the truth. In the beginning, the woman might still hope the silence was temporary. Royal life was unpredictable, and moments of distance sometimes appeared, even during periods of strong affection. But the court itself began to notice the change long before she fully accepted it. Servants sensed the difference first. They no longer hurried toward her rooms with the same urgency. Their greetings remained respectful. Yet the quiet excitement that once surrounded her household faded. Courtiers observed even more carefully. During banquets and ceremonies, they watched where the king's attention travelled. Conversations that once revolved around her presence began to shift toward other figures within the palace. The whispers circulating through the corridors grew softer whenever she passed. No one spoke openly about what was happening, yet everyone understood. The Tudor court possessed an almost instinctive awareness of shifting power. Those who lived within its walls learned to recognize the smallest changes in behavior: a missing letter, an absent gift, a delayed invitation. Each sign carried meaning. By the time the woman herself realized the pattern had become permanent, the palace had already adjusted. Servants moved more frequently through another set of chambers. Courtiers directed their smiles toward a different presence during gatherings. The invisible center of attention within the palace had begun to move. And with that movement came a strange, heavy quiet. The rooms that once seemed alive with expectation now felt larger and colder. Even familiar sounds, the distant music of evening feasts, the echo of footsteps through long corridors, carried a new distance. What had once been warmth had become silence. When the silence of royal indifference finally settled into the rhythm of palace life, its meaning became impossible to ignore. Letters no longer arrived. Gifts no longer appeared. And the small signals of affection quietly vanished. By the time she fully recognized the change, the entire court had already understood what her future inside the palace would no longer be. A final meeting often arrived without ceremony in the Tudor court. By the time such a moment appeared, the silence that had slowly settled around the relationship had already done most of the work. The absence of letters, the disappearance of small gifts, and the shifting attention of the palace had quietly prepared everyone for what was coming. The message that summoned her came in a manner that felt strangely ordinary. A palace attendant appeared at the doorway of her chamber with a short instruction. The king wished to see her privately. The servant's voice carried no special urgency. The words sounded formal, almost routine, as though this invitation belonged to the same category as dozens of others delivered each day within the palace. Earlier in their relationship, such summons had felt very different. A private invitation from the king had once carried excitement. It meant that somewhere within the vast stone palace, his attention had turned toward her alone. Servants delivered those messages with quiet smiles, aware that they carried news that could brighten an entire evening. Now the atmosphere surrounding the invitation felt cooler. The woman rose from her chair and prepared herself carefully. The familiar rituals of court life remained unchanged. Her gown was arranged neatly, her hair adjusted by attendants who had served her faithfully for months. Every detail suggested dignity and composure. Yet the mood inside the room was different. The servants working quietly nearby understood more than they allowed themselves to say. They had watched the change unfold over many days. Messages had stopped arriving. Courtiers had begun to speak of other names in the palace corridors. Even without direct confirmation, the household had sensed that something important was ending. The walk through the palace corridors felt unusually long. Stone walls stretched beside her, hung with tapestries that depicted ancient battles and royal ceremonies. Candlelight flickered softly along the carved wood panels. From distant chambers came the faint sound of musicians preparing for an evening feast. Life within the palace continued exactly as it always had. Courtiers moved through the galleries in small groups. Servants carried trays of wine toward the banquet hall. Guards stood motionless beside heavy wooden doors. Nothing in the palace suggested that anything unusual was happening. Inside the private chamber where the king waited, the atmosphere carried a quiet restraint. He greeted her with the same courtesy that governed most royal interactions. His voice remained calm. His expression showed neither anger nor great emotion. This was how Tudor power often behaved. Confrontation was rarely necessary. Decisions could be delivered through carefully chosen words that avoided direct accusation. Even endings could appear gentle when expressed with royal composure. The conversation itself was brief. The king spoke of many things that sounded reasonable. Duties demanded more of his time. The court was changing. Circumstances had shifted in ways that required adjustment. Each sentence sounded polite. None of them explained the truth directly. Within the careful language of the Tudor court, such explanations served as a kind of graceful distance. They allowed both people to acknowledge what was happening without transforming the moment into open conflict. The woman listened quietly as the meaning became clear. Affection that had once shaped her daily life had simply run its course. The attention that once drew her close to the center of royal power had moved elsewhere. No accusation accompanied the change. No blame appeared in the king's voice. The relationship had not ended with anger. It had ended with the same quiet inevitability that governed so many other movements within the palace. The most striking feature of this moment was its simplicity. No ceremony marked the conclusion. No official announcement would inform the court that the relationship had ended. Even the servants who waited outside the chamber would hear nothing beyond the simple fact that the meeting had been short. Such discretion protected everyone involved. For the king, it preserved dignity and avoided unnecessary scandal. For the woman, it allowed her departure from favor to remain quiet enough to protect what remained of her reputation. When the conversation ended, the farewell carried the same restrained politeness that had shaped the entire meeting. A few final words of courtesy were exchanged. Then the woman turned and walked back through the same corridors she had crossed only moments earlier. The palace around her appeared unchanged. Music still drifted through distant rooms. Courtiers continued their conversations beside the tall windows overlooking the gardens. Servants moved quickly along the passageways, carrying trays of food for the evening meal. Yet something fundamental had shifted. Promises spoken in earlier months were no longer mentioned. Plans that once seemed possible had dissolved quietly into memory. The chambers she had occupied, the attention she had received, and the influence she had briefly enjoyed now belonged to a different chapter of palace life. The Tudor court had already begun adjusting to its next arrangement of favour. By the time she reached her own rooms again, the change had become unmistakable. The meeting had ended without anger, without a dramatic farewell, and without ceremony. What remained was a quiet understanding shared by everyone within the palace walls. Royal affection had moved on. A final private meeting often ended not with conflict, but with calm words and careful distance. Promises once spoken during moments of affection faded quietly into memory without being repeated. When she stepped back into the palace corridor, it had already become clear that the court had moved forward, while her place beside the centre of power had quietly disappeared. Departure from royal favour rarely happened through a dramatic removal. In the Tudor court, disappearance usually unfolded quietly, through a series of small adjustments that slowly erased a woman from the centre of palace life. The first change often appeared in the rooms she occupied. Chambers inside a royal palace were never truly private property. Every room belonged to the crown, and every space could be reassigned whenever court arrangements shifted. While the woman remained close to royal favour, her rooms felt secure. Servants maintained them carefully. Fires were kept burning in the hearth. Fresh linens and polished furnishings reflected the comfort she had grown accustomed to. Once the king's attention moved elsewhere, that sense of permanence began to fade. At first, the change seemed subtle. A servant might mention that certain furnishings were needed in another part of the palace. An attendant might ask whether a smaller chamber would be more convenient for the coming season. The requests sounded practical rather than deliberate. Gradually, the process became clearer. The rooms that once seemed firmly hers began to empty. Tapestries were removed from the walls and carried down quiet corridors. Chairs and tables disappeared one by one, taken to furnish other apartments newly assigned to rising figures at court. Even the servants responsible for maintaining her chambers began to visit less frequently. Nothing about this transition was announced openly. Instead, the palace adjusted itself through quiet efficiency. Rooms that once belonged to a favoured mistress soon appeared, ready for another occupant whose presence better matched the current flow of royal attention. At the same time, the household that had served her began to dissolve. During the height of royal favour, a mistress often maintained a small group of attendants, ladies-in-waiting, assisted with clothing and daily routines. Servants carried messages, arranged meals, and maintained the steady rhythm of household life. Their loyalty had once been directed toward the woman whose position seemed secure. When that position weakened, their roles changed as well. Some attendants were reassigned to other households within the palace. Others returned to service under noble families connected to the court. A few remained, temporarily, continuing their duties with quiet professionalism until new instructions arrived. The departure of these familiar faces altered the atmosphere of the household more than any official statement could have done. Rooms that once felt busy with conversation grew quiet. Footsteps in the corridors became less frequent. The gentle routines of daily service faded until the chambers felt strangely large and empty. Even the sound of doors opening and closing seemed louder when so many people had quietly disappeared. Meanwhile, life in the palace continued with its usual elegance. Banquets still filled the great halls with music and laughter. Courtiers still gathered beneath chandeliers of candlelight. Conversations moved easily between politics, marriages, and the subtle movements of influence that defined Tudor society. Yet within those lively gatherings, one small detail had changed. Her name no longer appeared in conversation. Earlier in the year, whispers about her presence had travelled constantly through the palace. Courtiers spoke about the gowns she wore, the jewels she received, and the time she spent in the king's company. Servants carried fragments of these conversations from one chamber to another. Now those whispers had faded. When guests assembled for feasts, new topics filled the air. Attention turned toward other figures whose presence seemed more closely connected to the king's current interests. The woman who had once attracted curiosity and speculation gradually slipped beyond the center of those discussions. The absence felt almost deliberate, not because anyone wished to insult her openly, but because Tudor court culture valued discretion above confrontation. Ignoring a fading figure allowed the court to preserve the illusion that nothing uncomfortable had taken place. This silence served an important purpose. It protected the dignity of the king by avoiding public acknowledgement of shifting affection. It also allowed the woman herself to leave the center of court life without suffering the humiliation of open rejection. In this way, disappearance became a kind of quiet agreement, shared by everyone within the palace walls. The room she had once occupied belonged to someone else. The servants who had once served her had scattered into new households. Conversations that once revolved around her presence now flowed easily without mentioning her at all. Life at court had simply continued forward. The Tudor palace possessed an extraordinary ability to reorganize itself around changing currents of attention. When one figure faded from prominence, another quickly took their place. The structure of influence adjusted smoothly, leaving little visible trace of what had existed before. For the woman who had once stood close to the center of power, this transformation felt both subtle and complete. Nothing dramatic had occurred, yet everything had changed. Royal favor did not need a scandal to erase a woman from the center of Tudor court life. Rooms were reassigned, households dissolved, and conversations quietly shifted toward other names. Before long, the palace that once seemed to revolve around her presence continued its elegant routines, as if she had never belonged to its brightest circles at all. Time after the court rarely changed all at once. Instead, the transformation unfolded slowly, through the quiet routines of ordinary days that no longer resembled the life once lived inside the palace walls. In the beginning, many objects from that earlier world remained. Velvet gowns still rested inside wooden chests. Their fabric retained the deep colors that had once shimmered beneath candlelight during royal banquets. Silk ribbons lay folded between layers of linen, and small pieces of jewelry waited inside velvet boxes, untouched for weeks or months at a time. These objects carried a strange silence. They had once belonged to evenings filled with music, laughter, and bright conversation. Now they existed in still rooms where only the sound of footsteps or the turning of a key disturbed the air. Opening a chest of clothing could feel like reopening another life. A gown embroidered with gold thread might still hold the faint scent of the palace halls where it had once been worn. Pearls that once rested against warm skin during long feasts now lay cool and motionless in the darkness of their cases. The objects themselves had not changed. The world around them had. Beyond the rooms where these belongings were stored, life moved in a very different direction. The palace that once seemed familiar had gradually become distant. Invitations no longer arrived. Messengers no longer knocked at the door carrying folded letters sealed with wax. Most telling of all, the great doors of the royal halls no longer opened. Those doors had once welcomed her presence with effortless ease. Guards stepped aside without question. Servants guided her through corridors lined with carved wood and tapestries depicting ancient victories. Music drifted through the halls as nobles gathered beneath chandeliers of candlelight. That world had not disappeared. It simply continued without her. Inside the palace, banquets still filled the great chambers with voices and laughter. Courtiers still discussed alliances, marriages, and the shifting currents of royal influence. New figures moved through the galleries, where she had once walked with confidence. Her absence left no visible interruption. For the court, change always arrived quietly. When attention moved from one person to another, the palace adjusted itself with remarkable ease. Rooms were reassigned. Conversations shifted. And life continued as though nothing had altered. For the woman who had once belonged to that world, the contrast could feel striking. Objects from the past remained tangible. Velvet gowns could still be touched. Jewels could still catch the light. Yet the doors that had once led into the heart of royal life were now closed. No decree had forbidden her return. No guard had spoken harshly at the entrance. But the invisible network of favor that once allowed her to pass freely through those halls had vanished. Without that quiet permission, the palace simply ceased to be part of her daily world. In the quiet rooms where she now lived, memory began to take on a new role. Moments from earlier months returned unexpectedly. The sound of musicians tuning their instruments before a feast. The warm glow of hundreds of candles reflected from polished silver plates. The murmur of courtiers leaning closer to exchange rumors that traveled quickly through the palace corridors. These memories remained vivid, perhaps even more vivid than the present. Time often sharpened such recollections, rather than softening them. The mind returned again and again to certain images. A particular evening, a glance exchanged across a crowded hall, the quiet thrill of knowing that royal attention rested nearby. Yet, memory possessed one important difference from reality. It could not open doors. No matter how clearly those earlier moments returned, they belonged to a chapter of life that had already closed. The palace still existed. The court still celebrated its ceremonies and alliances. But the path leading back into that world had quietly disappeared. For many women, who had once lived close to royal favor, this transformation created a peculiar mixture of gratitude and distance. They had seen a world few others ever witnessed. They had walked through halls where the fate of kingdoms was discussed between courses of a banquet. They had experienced a kind of influence that existed only within the rare atmosphere of the royal court. But when that moment ended, what remained was something less visible. Not jewels, not gowns, not even the memory of rooms once filled with servants and music. What remained most strongly was the knowledge that such a life had existed at all. Velvet gowns might still rest inside quiet chests, and jewels might continue to catch the light in silent rooms. Yet the palace doors that once opened without hesitation no longer moved for her presence. In time, the most valuable thing left from those brilliant days was not gold or land, but the memory of how close she had once stood to the center of Tudor power. Distance from the Tudor court often brought a kind of quiet that felt unfamiliar at first. After months or years spent among candlelit halls and constant whispers, the countryside seemed almost unnaturally calm. Many women who had once lived close to royal favor eventually settled in estates far from the palace. These properties were rarely grand castles or vast lands. More often, they were modest manors or small houses surrounded by fields, orchards, and narrow country roads. The change in rhythm was immediate. In the palace, life had followed the restless movement of court society. Messengers arrived without warning. Musicians played during feasts that lasted deep into the night. Courtiers moved constantly between chambers, carrying rumors, news, and invitations. In the countryside, mornings arrived quietly. Mist rose slowly from the fields. Servants opened shutters to let pale light enter the rooms. Instead of the distant echo of palace musicians, the sound of wind through trees filled the air. Days unfolded at a slower pace. A former mistress might walk through gardens rather than through stone corridors. Instead of attending royal ceremonies, she watched the practical routines of estate life. Farmers working the land, servants tending animals, and small tasks that marked the passing of ordinary days. For some women, this quiet felt like relief. The Tudor court demanded constant awareness. Every conversation carried hidden meanings. Every glance from a nobleman or noblewoman could signal alliances or dangers. Living within that environment required endless caution. Away from the palace, that pressure faded. Conversations no longer revolved around politics. Visitors arrived less frequently, and when they did, their concerns were usually practical rather than strategic. Harvests, weather, and household matters replaced the endless speculation that had once filled court corridors. This distance from politics was often intentional. A woman who had once been close to royal attention understood how easily rumors could return. Even a small suggestion of continued influence might draw unwanted scrutiny. By living quietly and avoiding public involvement in court affairs, she protected herself from becoming a subject of new gossip. Silence became a kind of shield. Letters to the palace were written carefully, if they were written at all. Visits to London happened rarely. The woman who had once stood near the centre of royal influence now allowed that world to move forward without her presence. Yet, life in the countryside was not entirely free from tension. Reputation followed people long after they left the court behind. Neighbours in nearby towns sometimes knew fragments of the story. Travellers carried rumours from the capital. Even distant relatives occasionally asked careful questions about the years spent inside the palace. Maintaining dignity required a careful balance. The former mistress could not deny the past entirely. Yet speaking openly about it risked reviving curiosity. Instead, many women adopted a quiet composure. They spoke politely, avoided unnecessary explanations, and allowed their present lives to define them rather than their earlier experiences. Household routines helped create that sense of stability. Servants who remained loyal continued their duties with calm efficiency. Meals were prepared at regular hours. Rooms were maintained with modest comfort rather than palace extravagance. Visitors were welcomed politely, though rarely with the grandeur once seen in royal halls. Gradually, the countryside began to feel less like exile and more like a new form of life. Seasons passed through the estate in steady patterns. Spring brought green fields and careful planting. Summer filled the orchards with fruit. Autumn marked the harvest. And winter settled quietly across the land. Within this slower rhythm, memories of court life sometimes felt distant, almost unreal. The noise of royal banquets, the glitter of jewels beneath candlelight, and the constant movement of courtiers belonged to another world entirely. Here, the days were measured not by royal ceremonies, but by the changing light across the fields. Yet beneath this calm existence remained a delicate truth. Honour still mattered. The woman who had once lived close to the king carried a reputation that could never disappear completely. Her behaviour in the countryside would determine whether that reputation faded peacefully or returned as gossip. Living quietly became an act of preservation, polite conduct with neighbours, generosity toward local communities, and restraint in conversation helped protect what remained of her dignity. In a society that watched carefully for signs of scandal, such behaviour mattered greatly. Through patience and distance, a fragile respectability could slowly take root. The woman who had once stood in the bright centre of the Tudor court now lived within a quieter landscape, where fields replaced banquet halls, and careful silence replaced the restless whisper of palace politics. Life far from the Tudor court unfolded slowly, shaped by quiet fields rather than candle-lit ceremonies. Distance from politics protected a fragile reputation that could still be easily disturbed. Within that quiet world, the woman who once lived near royal power learned that survival now depended not on attention, but on careful restraint. Life in the countryside rarely remained entirely free from the expectations of Tudor society. Even after the distance from the court had softened old rumours, another form of pressure gradually began to appear. Family. In the Tudor world, marriage was more than a private decision between two people. It functioned as a tool for stability, reputation, and social order. When a woman who had once been connected to royal favour returned to quieter surroundings, her relatives often began to consider how that chapter of her life might be carefully closed. Marriage offered one possible answer. For families concerned about reputation, arranging a respectable union could restore balance. A husband with a modest title, a comfortable estate, or a reliable position in local society could provide the appearance of stability that the past had unsettled. Discussions about such possibilities often began quietly. Letters passed between relatives. Conversations took place beside fireplaces in country houses, far from the capital. Names were mentioned, examined, and set aside. Some candidates came from neighbouring estates. Others were widowers whose own circumstances required a careful arrangement rather than romantic enthusiasm. These negotiations rarely mentioned the past directly. Everyone involved understood the situation without speaking openly about it. The woman's years near the Tudor court were not denied, yet they were rarely described in detail. Instead, conversations focused on the future, a stable household, a respectable name, a life that no longer depended on whispers from palace corridors. For the woman herself, the idea of remarriage could feel complicated. Marriage promised security that royal affection had never offered. A husband could provide legal protection, social recognition, and the ordinary stability of shared domestic life. In Tudor society, such protection mattered greatly. A married woman held a position that the world understood and accepted, yet entering a new marriage also required careful silence. Her earlier life near the king could not simply disappear, but it could be reshaped. Stories were adjusted. Certain details were omitted. What had once been a central chapter of her life gradually became a brief and distant episode, mentioned only when necessary. Sometimes the explanation sounded simple. She had served at court. She had known influential figures. Circumstances had changed. These phrases carried just enough truth to satisfy polite curiosity while avoiding deeper questions. Prospective husbands rarely asked for more. Many men entering such marriages had their own practical concerns. Some needed a capable mistress of the household after the death of a previous wife. Others valued the woman's familiarity with court etiquette and social manners. A connection, even a distant one, to royal circles could sometimes enhance a man's own reputation within provincial society. Thus, the marriage arrangement became an exchange of quiet advantages. For the woman, it offered protection and a path back into ordinary social life. For the husband, it provided a partner whose experience within high society carried a certain distinction. Yet beneath these practical considerations lay a delicate transformation. The woman who had once lived in the unpredictable light of royal attention now stepped into a role defined by steadiness rather than excitement. The rhythms of daily life shifted again. Instead of listening for rumours from London, she supervised servants, managed household accounts, and welcomed guests from neighbouring estates. These routines created a sense of order that the court had rarely offered. The past did not vanish completely. Memories of palace corridors and candlelit banquets sometimes returned unexpectedly. Certain pieces of jewellery or clothing still carried the faint echo of those earlier years. But within the structure of marriage, those memories gradually lost their ability to shape the present. Over time, the world around her began to see her differently. No longer the woman once associated with royal favour. She became the wife of a respectable household. Her responsibilities and reputation were defined by her marriage rather than by the uncertain affection of a king. This transformation required patience. Silence about the past remained essential. Stories that might revive old gossip were avoided. Instead, the household moved forward with the steady confidence expected of respectable Tudor families. The court continued its restless cycle of attention and replacement far away in London. Meanwhile, in the quieter countryside, another life slowly took root. Marriage offered a path back into the stable structure of Tudor society, where reputation could be rebuilt through careful silence. A new household allowed the past to fade into polite explanation rather than open scandal. Yet even within that stability, one quiet reminder of earlier days sometimes remained, waiting in the background of family life. Children changed the meaning of a woman's past in ways that no marriage arrangement could fully control. In the Tudor world, the birth of a son carried weight that extended far beyond the walls of any household. A child could transform memory into legacy. For a former mistress of the court, this transformation was particularly complicated. Her life had once revolved around attention that arrived suddenly and disappeared just as quickly. Yet a son created something more permanent, something that could not be dismissed as easily as a forgotten relationship. The presence of a boy raised quiet questions. Servants sometimes noticed the resemblance first. A familiar shape in the child's face, a certain expression in the eyes, or the particular curve of a smile could remind observers of someone powerful who had once walked the halls of the Tudor court. No one spoke openly about such similarities. Still, the possibility lingered in the air. If the father chose to acknowledge the child, the boy's life could change dramatically. Recognition did not always mean full legitimacy, but it could bring protection, education, and opportunities unavailable to most children born outside formal marriage. Such acknowledgement often happened carefully. A letter might arrive bearing the seal of an influential household. A modest allowance could appear, sent quietly through trusted intermediaries. In some cases, arrangements were made for tutors or apprenticeships that would guide the boy toward a respectable future. These gestures rarely carried public explanations. The Tudor court preferred discretion when dealing with matters of blood and reputation. Official records might remain silent, yet those involved understood the significance of such support. For the mother, these developments created both relief and unease. Relief came from the possibility that her child would not be left vulnerable in a world where lineage determined opportunity. If a powerful father recognized the boy in even a limited way, the child's path through society could become far less uncertain. Unease followed close behind. A son who carried traces of royal or noble blood could never exist entirely outside the shadow of that connection. Every advantage he received also reminded others of the circumstances surrounding his birth. The boy himself might not understand these tensions during childhood. To him, life within the household felt ordinary. He learned to walk along garden paths, listen to lessons from tutors, and watch the rhythms of estate life unfold day after day. The complicated story behind his existence remained largely invisible during these early years, but adults around him knew the truth. Neighbors might speak carefully when discussing the child. Some treated him with polite respect, while others watched with quiet curiosity. A boy rumored to possess powerful bloodlines could attract attention even in the quietest countryside. The mother understood this attention well. Her own past had taught her how fragile favor could be, and how quickly admiration could transform into suspicion. Protecting her son required the same careful balance she had once practiced within the Tudor court. Silence remained her strongest tool. The child's father might never be mentioned directly within the household. Conversations about the past were brief and cautious. When questions arose, they were answered with calm explanations that revealed little. In this way, the boy's life unfolded between two worlds. One world was visible and ordinary: family meals, lessons, and the steady routines of rural life. The other world existed quietly beneath the surface, shaped by bloodlines and decisions made far away in royal chambers. As the boy grew older, the significance of these hidden connections could slowly emerge. Education became particularly important. A child whose origins carried uncertainty needed skills and discipline strong enough to support his reputation. Tutors emphasized reading, writing, and the social manners expected of a gentleman. Preparation for adulthood began early. The mother watched this process with a mixture of pride and caution. Every success her son achieved strengthened his chances of living securely within Tudor society. Yet each step forward also carried the faint echo of a past she could never entirely erase. In the end, the boy represented both protection and a reminder. He offered the possibility that her life would leave something lasting beyond the fragile attention of courtly favor. At the same time, His existence preserved a link to the years she had spent near power, years that could never be fully forgotten. Within the quiet halls of the countryside estate, that dual meaning remained present every day. A son could transform a fading relationship into something that still carried weight within Tudor society. His existence offered protection and opportunity, yet it also preserved the memory of a past the court preferred to leave behind. In the quiet years that followed, one question lingered beneath every polite conversation: what might happen when that child's name began to reveal more than the palace ever intended to admit? A child carried a kind of truth that even royal silence could not erase. In the Tudor world, bloodlines had a way of surviving long after relationships faded from public memory. For a woman who had once lived under royal attention, the presence of a child quietly changed the meaning of everything that came after. What might have been dismissed as a passing chapter in the court's restless life could become something more lasting once a son existed within the world. Time could soften rumours. Years might pass without the palace mentioning her name. New alliances formed. New scandals captured attention. The court moved forward with the steady rhythm of politics and ambition. Yet lineage did not disappear so easily. Within the quiet halls of a countryside estate, a child grew older. His life might appear ordinary at first glance. He walked through gardens, listened to lessons from tutors, and learned the discipline expected of a young gentleman. But small details often carried quiet significance. The shape of a boy's face sometimes echoed the features of someone powerful. The tone of his voice, the confidence in his posture, or the sharpness of his gaze could remind older observers of men who once held authority within the royal court. Servants noticed such things first. Those who had once lived in or near the palace possessed a careful memory for faces and gestures. They recognized similarities that others might overlook. Though these observations remained unspoken, the recognition lingered in the atmosphere of the household. Visitors sometimes sensed it as well. A travelling nobleman might pause for a moment while speaking with the boy. A distant relative could look more closely than necessary during a polite conversation. None of them would voice their suspicions directly. Yet the thought passed silently from mind to mind. Blood had its own language. In Tudor society, lineage shaped opportunity, reputation, and power. Even a suggestion of royal connection could alter the way people behaved toward a child. Respect became slightly more careful. Expectations grew quietly higher. The boy himself rarely understood these subtleties. During childhood, the world felt simple. Lessons filled his mornings. Walking across fields filled his afternoons. The deeper meaning behind the careful attention of adults remained invisible to him. The mother, however, understood everything. Her own life had already revealed how fragile royal favour could be. She had watched attention rise and fall within the palace. He'd seen women celebrated one year and forgotten the next. The court possessed remarkable skill at rewriting its own memories. But a child complicated that effort. His existence preserved a living reminder of a relationship that might otherwise have vanished into silence. Even if the palace never acknowledged him publicly, the possibility remained present within every whispered observation. Occasionally, that possibility produced quiet gestures. A letter might arrive bearing the seal of a noble household connected to the court. A modest financial allowance could appear through trusted intermediaries. Arrangements for education might be offered without any official explanation. These acts rarely carried public acknowledgement. Still, they spoke clearly enough to those who understood Tudor customs. A boy supported in such ways might not receive a title or open recognition, but his future could still unfold differently from that of ordinary children. Opportunity followed recognition, even when recognition remained discreet. For the mother, this situation required careful balance. Her son represented both protection and risk. If powerful figures continued to show interest in his future, he might gain advantages that secured his position within society. At the same time, that same attention could revive questions about a past she had spent years trying to quiet. Silence, therefore, remained essential. Questions about the boy's origins were answered gently but briefly. Conversations rarely moved beyond simple explanations. The household continued its routines, as if the child's life carried no unusual significance. Yet beneath this calm routine lingered a quiet truth. The Tudor court could ignore a woman who had once stood within its private chambers. It could remove her name from ceremonies, letters, and official histories. But the existence of a child connected to that past created a thread that could not easily be cut. Blood endured even when memory faded. And sometimes, within the quiet unfolding of a child's life, that bloodline prepared to shape events in ways the court had never intended. A child carried the quiet persistence of bloodlines that royal silence could never fully erase, even when the palace tried to forget. The presence of that child kept the past alive within Tudor society. Far from the countryside estate, another challenge slowly waited within the watchful eyes of a world that never stopped judging. Life outside the Tudor court rarely meant complete freedom from its memory. Even after years of quiet living in the countryside, a woman who had once been known as a royal mistress continued to exist beneath a certain kind of attention. Not the attention of admiration, but the attention of suspicion. In Tudor society, reputation followed a person like a shadow. It did not disappear simply because a woman left the palace behind. The world remembered what the court preferred not to say openly. A former mistress carried a label that could not easily be removed. Among neighbours, distant relative, and visitors passing through the countryside, her past lingered in subtle ways. Conversations paused slightly when she entered a room. Polite smiles sometimes carried a hint of curiosity. Certain people watched her more closely than others. No one needed to speak directly about the past. Everyone already understood it. In the Tudor world, a woman's reputation was tied strongly to the idea of moral order. Marriage defined legitimacy, while relationships outside marriage existed in an uncomfortable grey space. Even when powerful men were involved, society tended to remember the woman more clearly than the man. This imbalance followed her wherever she lived. The king or nobleman connected to the story continued to exist within official history, surrounded by titles and achievements. Meanwhile, the woman associated with him often became little more than a quiet rumour, a name spoken carefully, a story hinted at but rarely explained. For the woman herself, daily life required patience. Every action carried meaning. Visiting neighbours too frequently might appear suspicious. Avoiding social gatherings could seem arrogant. Speaking openly about the past risked reviving rumours. Yet silence itself sometimes encouraged curiosity. Balance became essential. She learned to move through society with calm restraint. Conversations remained polite and measured. Personal details stayed private. Even gestures of kindness or generosity toward others were sometimes interpreted through the lens of her past. People watched closely. Women in nearby households often examined her behavior with particular interest. Some felt sympathy for her circumstances, understanding how fragile security could be in the Tudor world. Others viewed her presence with quiet caution. A former mistress reminded them of something uncomfortable. She represented the fragile boundary between respectable marriage and scandal. Men also observed her. Some treated her with formal respect, acknowledging the delicate reputation she carried. Others allowed curiosity to guide their behavior, attempting to learn details about the years she had spent near the court. Such attention rarely appeared openly hostile. Instead, it existed within the subtle language of Tudor social life. Longer glances during conversations, whispered comments exchanged between guests, and the careful questions that followed polite introductions. The woman recognized these signals immediately. Her years in the palace had trained her to read expressions and tone with remarkable precision. She understood when curiosity replaced courtesy, and when admiration shifted toward judgment. Because of this awareness, she chose her responses carefully. Arguments or emotional reactions would only strengthen gossip. Instead, she relied on calm composure, A quiet voice, a steady expression, and a refusal to engage with rumors allowed many conversations to end without conflict. Over time, this behavior created a certain distance. People continued to watch her, but they rarely found new material for a scandal. Without dramatic events or emotional outbursts to feed speculation, curiosity slowly began to fade. Yet suspicion never disappeared entirely. The Tudor world possessed a long memory for stories involving power and intimacy. Even when years passed quietly, the past remained present within the imagination of others. Children sometimes heard fragments of these stories from their parents. Travelers passing through the countryside carried new rumors from London. A single careless remark could bring the entire narrative back into discussion. The woman lived with this possibility every day. Her reputation rested not only on her own behavior, but also on the unpredictable curiosity of those around her. Maintaining dignity required constant awareness of how easily perception could shift. Within her own household, however, life felt more stable. Servants respected her authority. Daily routines created a sense of order. The quiet responsibilities of estate management replaced the restless uncertainty that had once defined her existence at court. In these familiar surroundings, suspicion lost some of its power. The woman understood that she could never erase the years she had spent near royal attention. Yet she could control how those years influenced the rest of her life. Patience and restraint slowly rebuilt a fragile form of respect. Neighbors began to see her less as a scandal and more as a figure of quiet endurance. The label of former mistress still existed, but it no longer dominated every conversation. Time softened even the sharpest rumors. Still, beneath the calm surface of countryside, life remained a subtle tension. Reputation might stabilize, but the Tudor world rarely allowed its stories to disappear completely. Somewhere, in the memory of those who remembered the court, the woman's past continued to exist. And sometimes that memory returned in unexpected ways. Living quietly in the countryside did not erase the label that Tudor society had once placed upon her. Suspicion faded slowly, yet the past remained present in the careful eyes of those around her. Within that fragile balance of dignity and doubt, another complicated relationship waited quietly in the background of her life. Encounters between a former mistress and a lawful wife rarely belonged to the dramatic confrontations imagined in stories. In Tudor society, such relationships more often unfolded within quiet gestures, careful distance, and unspoken understanding. Both women knew the truth. One carried the protection of marriage, a law, and family alliances. The other carried the memory of a private relationship that had once drawn the attention of a powerful man. Their positions within society were not equal, yet their lives remained connected by a past neither could entirely erase. Sometimes that connection produced a silent compromise. Within noble networks, practical considerations often outweighed personal resentment. A lawful wife might recognize that the relationship had already ended and that public conflict would only revive a tension the household preferred to avoid. In such cases, distance became the solution. The two women rarely appeared in the same spaces. Invitations to gatherings were arranged carefully so that their paths did not cross. Letters and messages traveled through intermediaries rather than direct communication. No open hostility was required. By simply avoiding each other, both women protected their reputations and allowed time to soften the memory of the past. Yet this quiet compromise did not always bring peace. The lawful wife carried a position rooted in legitimacy. But legitimacy did not automatically erase discomfort. Knowing that another woman had once occupied an intimate place in her husband's life could remain an unwelcome reminder long after the relationship had ended. The former mistress represented a chapter that could never be completely rewritten. Her existence proved that affection, desire, or curiosity had once drawn the husband's attention away from the structure of marriage. Even when the affair belonged firmly to the past, the memory of it lingered within the household. For this reason, some wives preferred absolute separation. They avoided any acknowledgement of the woman's presence. Her name might never be spoken inside the house. Servants were discouraged from discussing events connected to the earlier relationship. Silence functioned as protection. If the former mistress remained distant from the household, the wife could maintain the appearance of harmony within her family. The world outside might still remember the story, but within the walls of her home, she controlled the narrative. From the perspective of the former mistress, this distance often felt unavoidable. She understood that her presence could never be neutral, even if years had passed since the relationship ended. Simply existing within the same social circle might reopen old tensions. For that reason, many women chose restraint. They avoided locations where the lawful wife might appear. Invitations connected to the husband's family were politely declined. When conversations drifted toward the past, the former mistress redirected the topic with calm composure. This careful behavior allowed both women to coexist within the same social world without direct conflict. Yet the emotional complexity of the situation remained. Each woman occupied a role shaped by Tudor expectations. The wife represented stability, legitimacy, and family continuity. The former mistress represented a different reality, the unpredictable power of personal attraction that existed beyond formal institutions. These roles rarely changed. The wife's authority within the household remained secure. Her name appeared in legal documents, family records, and church registers. History itself favored her position, preserving her place within the official structure of Tudor society. The former mistress existed on the edge of that structure. Her influence might once have been powerful within private chambers, but outside those walls, she possessed little formal recognition. Even when treated with politeness or respect, she remained a reminder of something the social order preferred to keep quiet. Over time, both women often learned to live with this uneasy balance. The wife continued her role within marriage, overseeing household affairs and maintaining alliances that supported her family's status. The former mistress built a quieter life beyond the court, focusing on personal survival rather than influence. Their paths rarely crossed, yet in the shared memory of the Tudor world, their stories remained connected. People who knew the past sometimes glanced from one woman to the other during gatherings, recalling a chapter that polite society never discussed directly. The tension existed not in open hostility, but in the knowledge both women carried silently. For each of them, dignity required restraint. The wife preserved her authority through composure and silence. The former mistress protected her fragile respectability by maintaining distance and refusing to revive old stories. Between them existed an unspoken agreement, shaped by necessity rather than friendship. And within that quiet agreement, the past remained present without ever being spoken aloud. Two women linked by the same man often lived within a careful distance, shaped by silence rather than confrontation. One represented legitimacy and stability, while the other carried the memory of a private chapter the household preferred not to revisit. Within that uneasy balance, another role slowly began to emerge for the woman who had once lived close to royal power. Life rarely ended simply for a woman who had once lived near the center of Tudor power. Even after royal attention faded and years passed in quieter surroundings, the knowledge she had gained within the court remained valuable in ways few people fully understood. The court had taught her how the world truly worked. Behind the glitter of ceremonies and noble titles existed a complex web of alliances, favors, and quiet negotiations. Relationships between families were rarely built on affection alone. They were shaped by property, influence, and the delicate balance of reputation. A woman who had once lived close to that environment carried an unusual advantage. She understood the language of power. Years spent observing court life had revealed the subtle signals that governed aristocratic society. A carefully chosen word during conversation, a particular tone within a letter, or the timing of a visit could communicate far more than any formal announcement. Such knowledge did not disappear when she left the palace. Instead, it gradually became a form of social currency among noble families living beyond the immediate reach of the Tudor court. Information about court etiquette and connections remained valuable. Many households still depended on alliances with powerful figures in London, and navigating those relationships required careful judgment. This was where the former mistress sometimes found a new role. Her familiarity with court customs allowed her to move easily within aristocratic circles that valued discretion and experience. Families seeking to strengthen their positions often looked for individuals who understood how delicate negotiations should unfold. Marriage arrangements became one of the most common areas where her knowledge proved useful. In Tudor society, marriage served as a tool for building alliances between families. Negotiations surrounding such unions required careful diplomacy. Families needed someone who could read intentions, anticipate conflicts, and guide discussions toward mutually acceptable outcomes. A woman who had once observed royal politics possessed precisely that ability. She understood how pride influenced decision-making. She recognized when silence meant disagreement and when enthusiasm concealed hesitation. These insights allowed her to navigate conversations that might otherwise collapse under tension. Gradually, her reputation within local noble networks began to shift. Instead of being remembered only for her earlier connection to royal favor, she became known as someone who understood people. Families invited her to gatherings where discussions about potential alliances quietly unfolded between formal dinners and private conversations. Her presence carried a subtle authority. She did not command attention through titles or wealth. Instead, she offered guidance shaped by observation and patience. When disputes arose during negotiations, she suggested compromises that allowed both sides to preserve dignity. Such interventions rarely appeared dramatic. A carefully worded suggestion, a reminder of shared interests, a quiet conversation between two individuals who had misunderstood each other. These small gestures often prevented larger conflicts. Because of this skill, families began to trust her discretion. Secrets shared within private conversations remained protected. Rumors that might damage reputations were never repeated. The woman who had once been the subject of court gossip now became someone who understood the value of silence. This trust strengthened her position within aristocratic society. Information moved carefully through her presence, though never publicly. She heard fragments of political developments, changes in royal favor, and shifts within noble alliances. While she no longer participated directly in court life, she remained connected to the network that surrounded it. Her past, once a source of vulnerability, gradually became a source of insight. Having witnessed both admiration and rejection within the Tudor court, she understood how fragile influence could be. This awareness allowed her to advise others with unusual honesty. Ambition required patience. Power demanded caution. Reputation could change overnight. Families valued such warnings. Young women, preparing for marriage, listened carefully when she spoke about court etiquette. Fathers arranging alliances considered her observations before finalizing agreements. Even men experienced in politics sometimes asked for her perspective on delicate matters involving honor and perception. In this way, the former mistress created a quiet but meaningful role within aristocratic society. She no longer depended on royal attention to define her importance. Instead, she used knowledge gathered during earlier years to guide others through the complexities of noble life. Yet her influence remained subtle. She avoided appearing overly involved in political affairs. Public ambition might revive old suspicions about her past. By maintaining modesty and restraint, she ensured that her contributions remained respected rather than questioned. The Tudor world valued individuals who could manage relationships without creating conflict. Within this environment, the woman who had once lived in the private chambers of power discovered a different form of relevance. Her experience, discretion, and understanding of human behavior allowed her to remain connected to the social networks that shaped the lives of noble families. Not through scandal, but through quiet usefulness, the woman who had once stood close to royal power slowly transformed experience into influence within noble society. Knowledge gained during earlier years allowed her to guide alliances and protect secrets with careful diplomacy. Yet, even as her role grew quieter and more respected, the shadow of the past still followed her into the later chapters of life. Life once surrounded by the brightness of the Tudor court did not fade suddenly. The transition from the centre of power to the quiet edges of society happened gradually, almost gently, until the difference became impossible to ignore. There had been a time when the palace halls felt alive at every hour. Candles burned late into the night, while musicians filled the great chambers with sound. Courtiers moved through corridors carrying letters, invitations, and rumours that could alter alliances before the next sunrise. Every door opened toward another conversation, another gathering, another moment of attention. Within that world, a woman connected to royal favour rarely experienced silence. Servants announced visitors constantly. Messengers delivered letters sealed with noble crests. Invitations to feasts and ceremonies arrived with such frequency that evenings often disappeared into a blur of conversation and candlelight. Even ordinary moments carried a sense of importance. Walking through the palace meant passing groups of nobles engaged in quiet negotiations. Attending a banquet meant sitting beneath painted ceilings while dozens of eyes observed every gesture. Each movement took place within an environment where power and reputation shaped every interaction. The court had its own rhythm. Music echoed through large halls. Laughter rose from gatherings where wine flowed freely. Silk gowns brushed against stone floors while conversations shifted from politics to gossip and back again. For those who lived close to royal attention, this atmosphere became familiar. Then, slowly, without ceremony, it ended. Life beyond the palace existed within a different kind of space. The countryside estate did not echo with musicians or restless courtiers. Instead, the quiet stretched across long corridors and gardens that followed the steady patterns of the seasons. Even the sounds changed. Where once there had been orchestras and voices, now there were only footsteps on wooden floors, a servant passing through the hall, the faint movement of wind outside the windows. Silence settled gently but firmly. At first, the contrast could feel unsettling. A woman accustomed to constant activity might wake during the night, expecting distant laughter or music from the palace halls. Instead, she heard nothing except the calm stillness of rural life. Days unfolded with a slower purpose. Morning light entered rooms without the urgency of court schedules. Meals took place quietly among a small household, rather than beneath the gaze of dozens of nobles. Conversations focused on local matters instead of royal politics. Gradually, the absence of the court became easier to accept. Without the pressure of constant observation, life found a steadier rhythm. There were gardens to maintain, letters to answer, and visitors who arrived without hidden intentions. The simplicity of these routines offered a kind of peace rarely available inside palace walls. Yet memory remained powerful. Certain moments carried faint echoes of earlier years. The sight of a velvet gown folded carefully inside a chest could recall evenings filled with candlelight. A piece of music heard during a church gathering might awaken memories of royal banquets long past. These recollections arrived quietly. They did not bring the excitement of the court back to life, but they reminded the woman that her story had once unfolded within that brilliant and demanding world. The difference between those two lives could be measured in small details. In the palace, footsteps were always followed by voices. In the countryside, footsteps faded into silence. In the palace, every gathering held the possibility of influence or danger. In the countryside, conversations carried little consequence beyond the walls of the estate. Time slowly reshaped the meaning of these changes. What once felt like loss gradually became a different kind of freedom, without the endless expectations of court life. The woman could exist without performing a role for an audience of nobles. Still, the memory of that earlier world never vanished completely. The great halls continued to exist somewhere beyond the quiet estate. Music still echoed beneath high ceilings. Courtiers still gathered beneath chandeliers to discuss alliances and ambitions. But the woman who had once stood among them now lived beyond that brightness. Her days unfolded along the quieter edge of Tudor society, where power no longer demanded her presence. And within that quiet, the sound that remained most clearly was the simple rhythm of footsteps moving through empty corridors. Life that once unfolded beneath palace chandeliers gradually shifted toward the quiet margins of Tudor society. The brilliance of court ceremonies faded into distant memory, while silence settled gently over everyday life. In that silence, another challenge slowly revealed itself within the private weight of solitude. Distance from the Tudor court did not always bring peace. For many women, who had once lived close to royal attention, the quiet countryside carried another experience that slowly became impossible to ignore: solitude. At first, the change appeared gentle. The estate felt calm, the routines simple, the responsibilities manageable. Compared to the restless tension of court life, this slower world seemed almost comforting. But time gradually revealed another truth. The palace had not only been a place of power, it had also been a place filled with people. Conversations filled every corridor, and friendships often formed within the shared pressure of court politics. Once removed from that environment, many of those relationships began to fade. Old acquaintances from the court rarely wrote letters. Some remained cautious about maintaining contact with someone whose past might attract curiosity. Others had simply moved on within the ever-changing social world of Tudor politics. Their attention shifted toward new alliances, new ambitions, and new figures rising within the palace. Months sometimes passed without a single message arriving from London. At first, this silence might appear temporary. The woman could expect that someone would eventually remember her. Perhaps a former companion would write with news of a wedding, a celebration, or the latest rumour circulating through the royal chambers. Yet the letters arrived less and less often. When they did appear, they tended to be brief and formal. The warmth that once existed in shared conversations was replaced by polite distance. News from the court arrived, filtered through cautious language rather than intimate storytelling. Gradually, even these letters stopped. This quiet withdrawal rarely happened through open rejection. Instead, it unfolded through small absences that accumulated over time. Invitations were no longer extended. Familiar names disappeared from correspondence. The woman who had once stood within the center of a busy social world found herself watching that world continue without her. In Tudor society, reputation influenced friendship more strongly than many people admitted. Associating too closely with a former royal mistress could create unnecessary questions. Even if the scandal had faded, some individuals preferred to avoid any reminder of it. Maintaining distance protected their own standing within noble circles. Because of this, relationships quietly dissolved. Women who had once shared private conversations during court festivities might now pass each other in silence if they happened to meet during a rare gathering. The ease that once existed between them no longer returned. The woman understood the reason, even when it was never spoken aloud. Her past had become a complication others preferred not to carry. Within the countryside estate, this realization often arrived during ordinary moments. A quiet afternoon with no visitors. A dinner table where conversation remained brief. A writing desk where letters once expected never appeared. Loneliness did not always arrive dramatically. Sometimes it existed simply as the absence of familiar voices. The memories of court life could intensify that feeling. In the palace, solitude had been rare. Even private chambers remained connected to the constant movement of servants, courtiers, and messengers. A person was rarely truly alone. Outside that environment, the silence became more noticeable. The estate corridors remained empty for long stretches of the day. Evenings passed without the sound of music or laughter. The world beyond the windows seemed calm. Yet that calm sometimes carried a weight difficult to describe. Within this quiet, the past often returned more strongly. Memories of earlier years resurfaced unexpectedly. The glow of candlelight during banquets. Conversations that once felt exciting and important. The presence of people whose lives had once intertwined closely with her own. These memories were not always comforting. Over time, they began to feel heavier. What had once been moments of triumph or excitement now appeared distant, almost unreal. The woman recognized that those experiences belonged to a version of her life that no longer existed. The realization brought a complicated emotion. Pride remained. She had once stood near the center of power. Few people could claim such proximity to the heart of Tudor politics. Yet the same memories also carried regret. If those years had not happened, perhaps life would now feel simpler. Perhaps friendships would have endured. Perhaps the quiet countryside would feel less like a place of retreat and more like a natural home. These thoughts rarely appeared in conversation. The woman understood that speaking openly about such feelings would serve little purpose. Instead, she carried them privately, allowing the past to settle slowly into memory rather than constant reflection. Over time, solitude became something she learned to live beside. The estate offered stability, and daily responsibilities provided structure. Servants respected her authority, and the land continued its steady rhythm through the seasons. These routines created a life that felt calm, even when the silence remained noticeable. Still, the past never disappeared completely. Every quiet moment contained the faint echo of a world that once moved quickly around her. And every letter that failed to arrive reminded her how easily people could step away from a story they preferred to forget. Friendships that once felt permanent slowly faded as distance and caution reshaped the woman's social world. Letters grew fewer until silence replaced the conversations that had once filled palace corridors. Within that quiet solitude, another uncomfortable reminder waited in the form of comparisons no one could entirely avoid. The Tudor court rarely left a position empty for long. Attention moved quickly from one person to another, especially when that attention belonged to a king or a powerful nobleman. For a woman who had once occupied that delicate place beside power, the arrival of someone new carried a meaning that could not easily be ignored. Replacement. It did not always happen suddenly. At first, it appeared through rumors, traveling slowly beyond the palace walls. A new name was mentioned in conversation. A young woman seen frequently in the company of courtiers. A whisper about admiration growing quietly within royal chambers. These fragments of news reached the countryside estate in different ways. Travelers passing through nearby towns sometimes spoke casually about events at court. Merchants who visited London returned with small pieces of gossip gathered in taverns and markets. Even distant relatives occasionally carried stories that had already spread widely among the nobility. Gradually, the rumors became clearer. A new woman had appeared near the center of attention. Descriptions often focused on youth. Observers spoke about her beauty, her graceful presence at banquets, or the charm she displayed during conversations with influential figures. Her name began appearing repeatedly in the stories circulating through Tudor society. For those still living within the palace, this development felt ordinary. The court had always functioned through cycles of admiration and replacement. A figure celebrated one year might fade quietly the next. Someone new stepped forward, attracting curiosity and excitement, while the previous favorite disappeared from daily conversation. Yet for the woman who had once held that place, the experience felt different. News of the new mistress did not arrive as a single dramatic moment. Instead, it unfolded through small details, repeated again and again. Each rumor added another layer to the realization that the court had fully moved on. At first, the reaction might have been simple curiosity. Who was this woman? What family did she belong to? How had she drawn the attention of someone so powerful? These questions often appeared natural, but curiosity gradually gave way to a deeper recognition. The qualities people praised in the new mistress sounded familiar. Observers admired her youth, her beauty, and her ability to capture attention within crowded rooms. These descriptions echoed the same language that had once been used to describe another woman years earlier. Time had shifted the roles. The former mistress began to recognize herself within the stories about the new favorite, but only as a reflection belonging to the past. The admiration that once surrounded her now focused entirely on someone else. This realization carried a quiet weight. Within the countryside estate, life continued calmly. Gardens were maintained. Household routines unfolded without interruption. Yet somewhere far away, the court celebrated a new figure whose presence now defined the center of attention. The contrast between those two realities could feel sharp. The palace continued its bright rhythm of music, conversation, and ceremony. The new mistress walked through the same corridors, attended the same banquets, and listened to the same whispers that had once surrounded another woman. But history rarely paused to acknowledge that earlier chapter. The new stories replaced the old ones almost effortlessly. Courtiers who once praised the former mistress now spoke enthusiastically about the beauty and charm of her successor. The language of admiration remained unchanged, only the subject had shifted. In this way, the woman who had once stood within the spotlight of royal favor slowly felt herself disappearing from the narrative, not erased, but pushed quietly into the background. The process rarely involved cruelty. Most people simply followed the natural movement of attention within the court. Their interest moved toward the newest source of fascination, leaving earlier figures behind without deliberate intention. Still, the emotional effect remained significant. To hear the same admiration once directed toward her now focused on another woman could create a sense of distance from the past. Moments that once felt extraordinary began to seem temporary, almost fragile in retrospect. The former mistress understood something the court itself rarely acknowledged. Royal attention did not belong permanently to anyone. Each woman who stepped into that role experienced the same brief period of brightness, followed by the same gradual fading. Youth and beauty attracted admiration, but time inevitably shifted attention towards someone younger. Within the quiet estate, this understanding gradually replaced any lingering sense of rivalry. The new mistress was not truly an enemy. She was simply the next figure within a pattern that had existed long before either woman appeared at court. Still, the feeling of being removed from the center of history remained difficult to ignore. Where once her name had circulated through palace corridors, now it rarely appeared in conversation. The court continued to write its story with new characters, while older ones slipped quietly into memory. And in that silence, the woman realized that the most difficult challenge was not replacement itself. It was the sense of slowly being forgotten. Royal attention had simply moved forward, celebrating a new face while leaving the past behind without hesitation. The admiration that once surrounded her now belonged entirely to another woman within the palace halls. Facing that quiet erasure forced her to discover a different kind of strength that did not depend on recognition at all. Not every struggle in Tudor society was fought with words. In many situations, the most powerful response was the decision to remain silent. For a woman who had once lived close to royal favor, this lesson became essential after her life moved beyond the palace. The court had already shown her how quickly admiration could turn into gossip, and how easily gossip could grow into scandal. Speaking openly about the past rarely brought relief. Within Tudor culture, words travelled quickly and rarely remained under control. A casual remark repeated by the wrong person could spread across noble households within days. A private confession might return months later in distorted form, reshaped by rumour and speculation. Because of this, silence offered protection. When questions appeared during conversations, the woman often responded with calm restraint. She neither denied nor confirmed details about earlier years. Instead, she allowed the conversation to drift towards safer subjects, offering polite responses that revealed nothing more than necessary. This behavior sometimes puzzled others. Some people expected emotional reactions when the past was mentioned. They anticipated anger, regret, or dramatic explanations about what had happened within the royal court. Instead, they encountered composure, a steady voice, a quiet smile, a refusal to continue the story. Over time, this restraint created its own form of authority. Individuals who attempted to provoke gossip eventually discovered that there was nothing new to repeat. Without dramatic statements or accusations, rumors gradually lost their energy. Silence closed the door that gossip required. The woman understood that defending herself publicly would only revive the very attention she wished to escape. Arguments might satisfy curiosity for a moment, but they would also give observers new material to discuss. Remaining quiet denied them that opportunity. This strategy required patience. In a society that valued reputation so strongly, it could feel tempting to explain the truth behind past events. The woman might have wanted to correct false assumptions or remind others that powerful men had played equal roles in the stories whispered about her. Yet Tudor society rarely judged those men with the same intensity. Public arguments about fairness would change little. Instead, they risked strengthening the label already attached to her name. By refusing to engage with those debates, she prevented the past from returning to the center of attention. Silence, therefore, became more than avoidance. It became a deliberate decision about how to protect dignity. Within her household, the same principle guided everyday life. Servants understood that certain topics were not discussed openly. Visitors rarely heard details about the years spent near the court. Even close acquaintances learned that curiosity about the past would receive only brief and careful answers. Gradually, this pattern created a stable environment. The estate became a place where the woman's identity rested on her present behavior rather than on stories from long ago. Guests spoke about harvests, marriages, and local news instead of palace scandals. This shift did not erase the past. People still remembered fragments of the earlier story. A former mistress of a king or nobleman could never fully disappear from collective memory. Yet, without new material to feed speculation, those memories faded into something quieter. Silence softened their impact. The woman herself discovered another advantage within this approach. By refusing to explain every detail of her life, she retained control over her own narrative. Others could imagine what they wished, but they possessed no confirmation from her own voice. Mystery replaced scandal, and mystery, in Tudor society, often inspired more respect than confession. Over time, the discipline of silence also changed how she viewed her own past. The experiences that once felt overwhelming gradually became distant memories. Without constant discussion to revive them, they settled quietly into the background of her life. This distance allowed her to move forward. The court continued its restless cycle of admiration and replacement far away in London. New figures rose and fell beneath the attention of powerful men. Meanwhile, the woman who had once stood among them built a quieter existence, grounded in patience and restraint. Silence did not erase what had happened, but it prevented the past from controlling what came next. And in the complex social world of Tudor England, that quiet discipline could become the strongest defense a person possessed. Silence allowed the woman to protect her dignity without reopening the stories the court preferred to leave behind. By refusing to argue or explain, she denied gossip the attention it required to survive. Within that quiet strength, another realization slowly began to emerge about how retreat itself could become a strategy for survival. Silence was not always a sign of defeat. In the Tudor world, where reputation could rise and fall within a single season, stepping back from attention sometimes required more wisdom than remaining within it. For a woman who had once lived under royal favor, this realization did not appear immediately. At first, distance from the court might have felt like a loss. The music, the lights of the great halls, the endless movement of courtiers discussing alliances and ambitions, all of it belonged to a life that had once seemed permanent. But time revealed a different perspective. The palace had never been a place of safety. Behind the polished ceremonies and elegant banquets existed a restless environment where admiration could transform into danger without warning. Every smile carried hidden meanings. Every conversation could influence reputation. Living close to power meant living close to risk. Those who remained within the center of attention rarely enjoyed stability for long. Favor shifted unpredictably. And the same voices that once praised a woman could later repeat stories that damaged her name. Seen from this distance, retreat began to look less like failure. The countryside estate offered something the palace rarely provided: control. Days unfolded without the constant observation of nobles searching for advantage. Conversations occurred without the pressure of hidden politics. Life could proceed quietly without becoming part of the court's endless theatre. At first, this quiet seemed unfamiliar. The absence of musicians in the evenings felt strange. The lack of visitors, arriving with urgent messages, created an unusual calm. Even the corridors of the estate sounded different from the bustling galleries of the palace. But gradually, this calm revealed its value. Without the court's constant scrutiny, the woman regained something she had not fully possessed before: privacy. Her decisions no longer served the expectations of powerful observers. Her movements did not inspire speculation among courtiers. This distance protected more than comfort. It protected the reputation. Within Tudor society, scandal often survived through repeated attention. The more a story circulated through conversations and gatherings, the stronger it became. When individuals withdrew from those spaces entirely, gossip lost the environment required to grow. Silence, therefore, functioned as a form of strategy. Rather than confronting rumors directly, the woman simply removed herself from the places where those rumors thrived. Without dramatic responses to provoke interest, the story slowly faded into memory. The court continued its restless cycle of admiration and rivalry, but it no longer revolved around her. Meanwhile, life within the estate developed a steady rhythm. Morning light entered quiet rooms without interruption. Household duties created predictable routines. Visitors arrived occasionally, bringing news from neighboring lands rather than palace intrigues. This slower life allowed reflection. The woman began to recognize how many figures at court had once envied the position she had occupied. Standing near the center of royal favor appeared glamorous from the outside. Yet those who had experienced it understood how fragile that position truly was. One misstep could end everything. A misunderstood conversation, a careless rumor, a shift in the king's attention. Each of these possibilities existed constantly within the palace. Outside that world, such dangers carried far less power. Reputation could stabilize through patience and restraint rather than through constant performance. In this way, retreat gradually transformed into survival. The woman who had once depended on royal admiration learned to build a life that no longer required it. Instead of waiting for invitations to court gatherings, she created stability through quiet independence. The estate became a place where dignity could grow again. Neighbors saw her as a composed figure, managing her household with calm authority. Servants respected her steady leadership. Even visitors who knew fragments of her past began to view her differently, not as a scandal, but as someone who had endured the unpredictable nature of power and chosen a wiser path. This transformation required humility. The palace still existed, glowing with music and candlelight somewhere beyond the countryside. New figures continued to rise within its halls. Their stories filled the same corridors where hers had once unfolded. But the woman no longer measured her life by that brightness. She understood something the court rarely admitted. Light often attracted danger, and sometimes the safest place to stand was just beyond its reach. Stepping away from royal attention revealed that retreat could preserve far more than it seemed to surrender. Silence and distance slowly transformed what once looked like loss into a deliberate form of protection. In that quiet strategy, time began to guide her toward the final years of life. When memory would matter more than ambition, age arrived quietly, almost gently, for those who had once lived inside the restless brightness of the Tudor court. Years passed in the countryside with a steadiness that palace life had never allowed. And gradually, the woman who had once stood close to royal favour found herself looking back rather than forward. Memory became a frequent companion. In earlier years, the court had always demanded attention toward the present moment. Banquets, ceremonies, conversations, and rumours filled each day so completely that reflection rarely found space to appear. There was always another gathering, another letter, another whisper that might change everything by morning. Now the pace of life had changed. Morning light moved slowly across the rooms of the estate. Servants completed their duties without urgency. The sounds of distant fields replaced the constant movement of courtiers and musicians. In this quiet environment, the past began to return with greater clarity. Certain details appeared unexpectedly vivid. The warmth of candlelight reflected from polished walls, the soft weight of velvet gowns worn during winter feasts, the hum of voices rises beneath the painted ceilings of the palace halls. The memories did not arrive all at once. Instead, they unfolded gradually, like pages of a story revisited after many years. A piece of music heard in a nearby church could bring back the sound of instruments that once echoed through royal chambers. The scent of polished wood might recall evenings spent walking along palace galleries after celebrations ended. These recollections carried both pride and distance. There had been a time when standing near the centre of Tudor power felt extraordinary. Few women experienced such proximity to the decisions and personalities that shaped an entire kingdom. Even brief moments within that environment could leave lasting impressions. Yet age altered the meaning of those memories. Looking back, the brilliance of the court appeared less permanent than it once had. What had seemed powerful and important during those years now revealed its fragile nature. Admiration had come quickly, but it had also disappeared just as easily. Royal favour, once so dazzling, had always depended on circumstances beyond anyone's control. A king's curiosity, a nobleman's affection, a sudden shift in political alliances. None of these forces belonged to the woman herself. They existed outside her influence, moving according to the unpredictable rhythm of court life. Understanding this truth came slowly. In youth, attention felt like recognition of personal worth. Compliments from powerful figures could appear sincere and lasting. Invitations to gatherings suggested importance within the royal world. But time offered a clearer perspective. The court admired many people briefly. Its enthusiasm moved from one face to another with remarkable speed. Each new favourite experienced the same bright moment before the cycle began again. Recognizing this pattern brought a surprising sense of calm. The woman no longer viewed her years near the court as a lost opportunity or a mistake. Instead, she saw them as a brief chapter within a much longer life. They had offered experience, insight, and memories that few others possessed, but they had never been meant to last forever. Age made this realization easier to accept. The countryside estate had become a stable home, shaped by routines that no longer depended on royal attention. Gardens grew according to the seasons. Servants remained loyal. Visitors arrived occasionally with news from distant towns rather than urgent whispers from the palace. Life felt grounded. Even the memories of the court gradually softened. The brilliance of those years remained visible, but it no longer carried the emotional intensity it once had. Instead, the past appeared like a distant landscape, familiar, significant, yet no longer capable of altering the present. Sometimes the woman wondered about the people who had once surrounded her. Some must have disappeared from history entirely. Others perhaps remained within noble households, continuing their own quiet lives. A few names might still appear in official records, attached to titles and achievements remembered by future generations. But the court itself had certainly changed. New figures had risen. New scandals had filled the corridors. The stories that once defined an era had been replaced by others equally dramatic. This understanding carried a subtle comfort. If the court had forgotten her, it had also forgotten many others who had once believed their presence permanent. Time reshaped every narrative eventually. The woman accepted this reality with calm dignity. Her memories belonged to her alone now, preserved not through royal attention, but through quiet reflection. The brilliance of those earlier years had faded, yet their lessons remained clear. Favor could dazzle, power could charm, but both were temporary. And recognizing that truth allowed the final years of life to unfold with a wisdom that youth rarely possessed. Looking back across decades revealed that royal favor had always been a passing moment rather than a permanent position. The brilliance of court life remained vivid in memory, yet it no longer defined the meaning of her life. As time continued, its steady movement forward, another question slowly emerged about how history itself would remember such lives. History rarely remembers people in the same way they remembered themselves. Time had a habit of reducing complicated lives into brief lines written in careful ink, preserving certain names while allowing others to fade quietly into the margins. In the Tudor world, this process followed a clear pattern. Kings stood at the center of the written record. Their decisions, envoys, marriages, and alliances filled the pages of chronicles kept by scholars and clerks. Their names appeared repeatedly in documents that described the rise and fall of dynasties. The king's story always remained visible. His victories were recorded. His policies were studied. Even his private life sometimes became part of the narrative historians attempted to preserve for future generations. Around him, other figures also found places within those pages. Lawful wives held a particularly secure position in historical memory. Their marriages formed the foundation of political alliances between powerful families. Because of this, their names appeared in legal records, church registers, and family genealogies. A queen or noble wife could rarely disappear entirely from history. Her role within marriage guaranteed recognition. She represented continuity, legitimacy, and the structure that sustained noble households. Historians writing about Tudor society naturally included her presence when describing the lives of kings and powerful men. The story of a royal mistress unfolded differently. Despite the influence she might once have held within private chambers, her existence rarely appeared clearly in official documents. Royal chronicles focused on public events rather than intimate relationships. As a result, the woman who had once stood near the center of power often appeared only briefly within historical records. Sometimes her name was mentioned in passing, a line describing a rumor, a letter hinting at a relationship, a small reference within the correspondence of a courtier who had witnessed events firsthand. These fragments formed the outline of her story. Unlike the king or the lawful wife, the mistress did not possess a formal role that historians were required to document. Her presence belonged to the private world of affection, desire, and personal influence, areas that official history frequently treated with caution. Because of this, many details disappeared over time. Stories that once circulated through palace corridors gradually faded as generations passed. New political developments captured the attention of chroniclers. The names of courtiers, indulgeurs, and companions who had once surrounded the king slowly slipped from memory. The mistress became a shadow within the narrative. Historians might acknowledge her existence when describing a particular scandal or emotional conflict at court. Yet after that brief appearance, the story usually returned to the official figures whose roles defined the structure of Tudor power. In this way, a life that had once felt intensely important could become little more than a footnote, a small detail attached to the biography of a king. For the woman herself, this outcome might have seemed strange. During her years near the palace, the world had revolved around the attention she received. Conversations paused when she entered a room. Courtiers watched carefully for signs of favor or rejection. Her presence carried meaning that influenced alliances and rivalries. Within the palace walls, she had felt central to the story. But history rarely preserves such experiences in full. The documents that survived focused on decisions affecting kingdoms rather than on the emotional lives of individuals. Personal relationships, unless they produced major political consequences, often remained outside the main narrative. This did not mean the mistress had been unimportant. In many cases, her influence shaped private decisions that later affected public events. A conversation within a quiet chamber could alter the mood of a powerful ruler. Advice offered during a moment of intimacy might influence actions taken days or weeks later. Yet these moments rarely appeared in written records. They existed within memory rather than documentation. Over time, historians attempted to reconstruct such stories from scattered evidence, letters, diaries, and fragments of correspondence sometimes revealed glimpses of the hidden relationships that had once shaped Tudor life. But the picture always remained incomplete. The mistress existed somewhere between history and rumour, partly documented, partly imagined. This uncertain position created an unusual form of legacy. Her life might not occupy the central pages of history books, yet it continued to intrigue those who studied the past. Readers wondered about the private world behind royal decisions, about the conversations and emotions that official records rarely described. Through that curiosity, the memory of such women survived, not as queens or political leaders, but as figures who briefly illuminated the hidden side of power. And within that quieter legacy, the woman who had once lived near royal favour remained present in a different way, less visible, yet still part of the larger story of the Tudor court. History carefully preserved the names of kings and the lawful wives who supported their dynasties. Women connected to royal favour often remained only as small notes within those larger narratives. Yet the brief moments they shared with power sometimes carried consequences that echoed far beyond the lines where their names were written. Time eventually carried every story toward the same quiet destination. The court that had once felt endless continued to change long after the woman, who had briefly stood within its light, stepped away from it. Years passed without her name being spoken in the palace. The great halls of the Tudor court remained full of life. New celebrations filled the chambers, where music once echoed during her own evenings of attention. New faces appeared beside powerful men. New alliances formed and dissolved within the endless movement of political ambition. The palace did not stop moving. Yet the woman who had once walked those corridors gradually disappeared from its daily memory. Servants who had known her grew older or left the court. Courtiers who had once watched her closely became occupied with other concerns. Even the rooms, where she had once waited for private meetings, eventually belonged to different occupants. Her absence did not create a disturbance. The court had always possessed the ability to continue without hesitation. Each figure who once seemed central eventually became part of the palace's long sequence of forgotten presences. This quiet fading was not dramatic. No official announcement marked the moment when her name stopped appearing in conversation. No ceremony acknowledged the end of her connection to the royal world. Instead, the process unfolded slowly through silence. First, the invitations stopped. Then the letters stopped. Eventually, even the rumours stopped. Life moved forward, and the story that had once seemed powerful became a distant memory, known only to a few who had witnessed those earlier years. Yet the meaning of that life did not disappear entirely. For a brief moment in time, the woman had stood close enough to power to influence the atmosphere of the Tudor court. Her presence had altered conversations, stirred curiosity, and shaped the private emotions of a man whose decisions affected an entire kingdom. Such moments were rarely recorded clearly in history, but they had existed. In quiet chambers where important conversations unfolded late at night, in corridors where courtiers whispered about the changing mood of a king, in gatherings where attention shifted subtly whenever she entered the room. During those moments, her life had touched the fragile balance of power that defined Tudor society. Even if that influence lasted only a short time, it remained real. Looking back across the years, the woman understood this with a calm clarity that youth had never allowed. The brilliance of royal favour had once seemed overwhelming, as if it might define her entire future. Now she saw it differently. Royal attention had been only one chapter among many. The years that followed, quiet days within the countryside estate, careful rebuilding of reputation, and the steady rhythm of ordinary life, had shaped her existence just as strongly as those earlier moments in the palace. Perhaps even more strongly, because those later years had belonged entirely to her own choices rather than to the unpredictable curiosity of powerful men. In the final stage of life, memory softened many of the sharper edges of the past. The excitement of court ceremonies became distant images illuminated by candlelight. The tension of palace politics faded into stories that felt almost unreal. Even the moment when royal favour first appeared in her life now seemed less dramatic than it had once felt. Time created perspective. The woman no longer measured her life according to the attention she had once received. Instead, she understood that the meaning of her story rested in something quieter. She had experienced the centre of power and survived its sudden disappearance. She had watched admiration transform into silence without allowing that silence to destroy her dignity. And she had lived long enough to see how quickly the world forgot what once appeared unforgettable. This realization carried no bitterness. The Tudor court had always been a place of movement rather than permanence. Every person who entered its orbit eventually stepped away from it. Some left through disgrace, others through death, and many simply through the slow turning of time. Her own departure had been one variation of that pattern. In the end, the palace continued its endless rhythm, while the woman's story moved into a quieter form of memory, perhaps somewhere in the archives of old letters. Her name still appeared briefly beside the name of a king. Perhaps a historian reading those fragments centuries later might pause for a moment, wondering about the life behind that small reference. But the woman herself no longer required such recognition. Her story had already unfolded fully within the years she had lived. The palace had once known her voice. The court had once watched her presence. And for a brief moment, within the long history of Tudor England, her life had shifted the atmosphere of power itself. Now, the palace stood far away, filled with new music, new faces, and new stories. The woman remained where time had gently carried her, beyond the noise of ambition, beyond the fragile brilliance of royal favour, resting within a silence that no longer needed to be broken. Good night, wherever you are listening from. I hope this quiet journey through a forgotten life of the Tudor world has allowed your thoughts to slow and your mind to rest. History is often written through the names of kings and queens, but sometimes the most human stories belong to those who stood briefly in the light before returning to the quiet edges of the world. Tonight, we have followed one of those lives, and as the night grows deeper, you can let the echoes of palace corridors fade gently away, leaving only the calm rhythm of your own breathing and the quiet comfort of sleep. Rest well, and may your dreams carry you peacefully into the morning.